An elderly woman known for healing an entire community suddenly collapses at her market stall, but what happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more. The air at Willowbrook Market was thick with the aroma of fresh produce, sizzling street food, and the earthy scent of herbs drying in the sun. Shoppers bustled from stall to stall, their voices blending into a constant hum of chatter and bargaining. In the middle of it all stood Mrs. Eleanor Grant, her hands expertly arranging bundles of chamomile, lavender, and dried peppermint on the display rack. Her touch was precise, her eyes sharp despite the fine wrinkles that framed them. Her stall, marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Eleanor's Healing Herbs," had become a staple of the market. People didn't just come for the herbs, they came for her. They came for the stories she told about the power of each plant, for her calm voice that felt like a balm to anxious souls. "Morning, Mrs. Grant," called out Mr. Thompson, a gruff but friendly butcher from across the way. He wiped his hands on his apron before giving her a wave. "You got anything to help me sleep better at night?" "Lemon balm tea, Mr. Thompson," Eleanor replied without missing a beat. Her fingers nimbly tied a small bundle of the herb with twine. "Brew it before bed, not too strong, and it'll ease your mind." "Appreciate it, ma'am." He smiled, taking the bundle and sliding a few crumpled bills into her payment jar. "You're a lifesaver, you know that?" Eleanor gave him a small smile, but her eyes held a weariness she didn't bother to hide anymore. "Just doing what I know, Mr. Thompson." What she knew had been passed down to her by her grandmother, a healer who had lived in a quiet rural town far from Willowbrook. Her grandmother's hands, worn with age, had taught Eleanor how to crush leaves to extract their oils, how to brew teas for pain relief, and how to recognize the subtle differences between plants that looked the same but had vastly different effects. She had grown up learning the ways of nature's quiet medicine, and now she shared that knowledge with the world around her. But knowledge alone didn't pay the bills. Behind her stall, folded neatly in a worn canvas bag, lay pieces of fabric and half-finished garments. She would sew in between selling herbs, her fingers moving deftly with needle and thread. For the past 3 years she had been picking up seamstress work for extra income. It was slow, tedious, and hard on her hands, but it was necessary. "Mom, we've been calling you for an hour." The voice came from behind her, sharp and familiar. She turned slowly to see Ethan standing there, his arms crossed, his phone in his hand. His face wore the look of a man who had been inconvenienced. "I'm working, Ethan," she replied, not bothering to hide the tiredness in her voice. "What do you need?" "Money," he said bluntly, stepping closer. His eyes flicked to the jar of cash on her stall. "I need $50 to pay the electric bill. I'll pay you back next week." "You said that last week," Eleanor shot back, narrowing her eyes. "I'm not made of money, Ethan. I've got rent, supplies, and—" "Come on, Mom," Ethan interrupted, his frustration bubbling over. "You know I'm looking for a job. I just need a little help right now." Looking for a job. The same words he'd been saying for months. Her fingers stopped tying the bundle of sage she'd been working on. She glanced at her son, taking in his wrinkled hoodie and the faint smell of cigarettes clinging to him. Her heart ached in a way that only a mother's heart could. She hated seeing him like this. But how many times had she given in, hoping this time would be different? She reached into the payment jar, pulled out 2 20s and a 10, and placed it firmly in his hand. "Last time, Ethan. No more excuses." He snatched it without a word of thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Mom." She watched him walk away, stuffing the bills into his pocket, his head bent as if the world owed him an apology. Eleanor exhaled deeply, steadying herself against the table. A pang of guilt crept in, as it always did. Ethan had so much potential as a child. He'd been curious, bright, and full of dreams. But somewhere along the way that light had dimmed, and Eleanor wasn't sure if it had been her fault or his. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her apron pocket. She pulled it out, squinting at the screen. It was Grace. "Hello," Eleanor said, placing the phone between her ear and shoulder as she rearranged her jars of tinctures. "Mom," Grace's voice came through with a sharp, irritated edge. "Did you send me that package I asked for?" "I needed it by today." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "I told you I'd send it this weekend, Grace. I'm busy right now." "Busy doing what?" Grace snapped. "You're always at that market, but you can't take 5 minutes to do one thing for me?" Eleanor's patience cracked. "I'm not your assistant, Grace. If you need something urgently, maybe you should learn to plan ahead." Silence. Then a scoff. "You always make everything about you, don't you?" Her daughter's words hit like a knife. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She bit her lip, swallowing down the sharp words she wanted to say. "Goodbye, Grace," she said quietly, ending the call and slipping the phone back into her pocket. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. She had customers to serve. Mrs. Dorothy Woods arrived at the stall just then, clutching her purse tightly. She was one of Eleanor's most loyal customers, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She eyed Eleanor with suspicion. "You all right, Eleanor?" Dorothy asked, placing a hand on her arm. Eleanor blinked, forcing herself to smile. "I'm fine, Dorothy. Just one of those mornings." Dorothy didn't look convinced. "You've been working too hard. You need to take a break." "I'll rest later," Eleanor said, dusting off her apron. "Right now, people need their remedies." Dorothy glanced at the jar of cash and then at the unfinished fabric tucked behind the stall. Her face softened. "People need you too, Eleanor. Don't forget that." Her words hung in the air long after she left. The afternoon sun grew hotter, and the hum of the market continued. People laughed, called out orders, and jostled past one another, too caught up in their own lives to notice the quiet woman behind the herb stall. But Eleanor saw them. She saw everything. Every face, every hurried glance. She saw herself in every tired woman pushing a stroller and every worn-down man counting change for a loaf of bread. Her hands moved automatically, wrapping bundles of rosemary, tying twine, handing off jars of tinctures to customers. But her mind was far away, replaying Ethan's ungrateful face and Grace's cold words. She had spent years raising them, giving them all she had, and still, it felt like it wasn't enough. As the sun began to lower, Eleanor rubbed her arm absently, feeling the ache again. It had been getting worse, but she brushed it aside like she did everything else. There were too many things to do, too many people who needed her. There was no time for pain. No time for rest. "Keep going," she muttered to herself, tightening her apron strings. "Just keep going." The sounds of the market swirled around her, vibrant and alive, but in that moment, it felt so far away. The sound of raindrops tapping against the kitchen window filled the cramped but cozy home of Mrs. Eleanor Grant. The air smelled of freshly brewed chamomile tea and faint traces of the lavender oil she used to calm herself after long days at the market. The soft patter of rain might have been soothing on another day, but today it only added to the heavy atmosphere in the house. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table, a stack of bills spread before her like an unwelcome hand of cards. Each envelope had the same grim tone, bold red lettering demanding immediate payment. Her brow furrowed as she calculated the total in her head. No matter how she did the math, it always came up short. She rubbed her temples, the ache in her arm from earlier in the week making itself known again. It was sharper today, shooting down to her wrist whenever she moved too quickly. She ignored it as she always did. There was no time to be sick and certainly no money to pay for a doctor. "Ethan, Grace, come to the kitchen please," she called, her voice firm but strained. It took a moment, but the thudding of feet on the stairs signaled that her children had heard her. Ethan arrived first, wearing headphones around his neck, his hoodie hanging loosely from his lanky frame. His eyes darted to the table, taking in the sight of the bills. "Another lecture, huh?" he muttered as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Sit down," Eleanor said, tapping the table with her fingers. "This isn't a lecture. It's a discussion." Grace appeared next, her phone in hand, fingers tapping rapidly on the screen. She barely glanced at her mother as she slid into a chair with the dramatic flair of someone being dragged into something they didn't care about. "What now, Mom?" Grace sighed, still looking at her phone. Eleanor's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her voice calm. "I need to talk to both of you about the bills." She gestured to the stack on the table. "The electric bill is overdue. Same with the water. I've been covering everything for too long, and I need you both to start contributing." That got their attention. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. Grace glanced up from her phone, frowning. "Contributing?" Ethan scoffed. "I don't even have a job, Mom. How am I supposed to contribute to anything?" "You don't have a job because you're not looking for one," Eleanor replied, fixing him with a sharp gaze. "You're 24, Ethan. 24. I'm not asking you to pay for everything, but you can do something." "Unbelievable," Ethan muttered under his breath, running a hand over his head. "You make it sound so simple, like I can snap my fingers and get hired tomorrow." "Jobs don't fall out of the sky, Ethan," Eleanor shot back, her voice growing more firm. "You have to apply, follow up, push through rejection. I taught you that." "No, what you taught me was to stress over every little thing like it's life or death," Ethan said, his words sharp and cutting. He pointed at her. "That's your problem, Mom. You act like the world is crumbling every day. Eleanor's heart ached at his words, but she refused to let him see it. She glanced over at Grace, who was unusually quiet. And you, Grace? You've been picking up extra shifts at the diner, haven't you? Can you help a little with the electric bill this month? Grace rolled her eyes, letting out a short, bitter laugh. Are you serious? I'm already drowning as it is. Every penny I make goes to my car payment and my credit card. I barely have enough left for groceries. She shot Eleanor a pointed look. If you didn't insist on controlling everything, maybe I wouldn't be in this position. Controlling? Eleanor blinked, stunned. Her fingers dug into the edge of the table. You think I'm controlling because I'm asking you to be responsible? I've worked 2 jobs for the past 3 years, Grace. 2 jobs. Just to make sure you two had a roof over your heads. And I'm the one being controlling? I didn't ask for that, Grace snapped, leaning forward. Her eyes were fierce now, filled with the fire of unresolved anger. I didn't ask for you to break your back for us. That was your choice. Silence hung in the air like a fog. For a moment no one spoke. The rain outside had picked up, tapping harder against the window. Eleanor's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Yes, Grace. It was my choice. And I'd do it again. But that doesn't mean you get to throw it back in my face like it means nothing. She looked at both of them, her eyes filled with exhaustion and pain. I'm not asking for much. Just a little help. Just something. For a moment, it seemed like her words might sink in. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the table, unable to meet hers. Grace bit her lip, her gaze flickering with a hint of doubt. But it didn't last. I'm done, Ethan said suddenly, pushing off the wall. I don't have time for this. He grabbed his hoodie and headed for the door. Where are you going? Eleanor asked, rising from her chair. Out, Ethan muttered, not looking back. Anywhere but here. The door slammed so hard that the sound echoed through the house. Eleanor closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She turned to Grace, her gaze pleading. Don't do this, Grace. Please. But Grace was already standing, sliding her phone into her pocket. You should have figured this out before calling us down here, Mom. You always do this, make us feel guilty like we owe you something. You do owe me something, Eleanor said, her voice rising. Her heart pounded in her chest. You owe me respect. Just a little respect, Grace. I'm not some stranger on the street. I'm your mother. Grace froze for a second, her eyes softening. But then just as quickly her face hardened. You're my mother, not my boss. And with that, she grabbed her coat and walked out the door, slamming it behind her. The sound of it echoed even louder than Ethan's. Eleanor stayed where she was, still gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles had gone white from the pressure. The room was quiet now, except for the soft tapping of rain on the window pane. Her chest felt tight, as though the weight of every unpaid bill, every harsh word, and every sleepless night had settled directly on her heart. She glanced down at the bills spread before her. They hadn't gone away. They wouldn't go away. Slowly she sat back down in the chair. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the envelopes. Past due. She stared at the words for a long time before letting it fall from her fingers. The tears she'd held back during the argument now slid silently down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, her breathing sharp and shallow. There was no time to cry. No time to feel sorry for herself. There were too many things to do, and she was the only one left to do them. No Ethan. No Grace. Just her. All right, Eleanor, she muttered to herself, rubbing her arm again as the ache flared up. You've done it before. You'll do it again. Her eyes shifted to the small clock on the wall. It was already late, but she still had a stack of sewing commissions waiting for her in the other room. She glanced at her hands, already feeling the burn of the needle between her fingers. I'll rest later, she whispered to herself. And then she got up, pulled the stack of bills into a neat pile and walked to her sewing room. Her footsteps were slow but steady. Her eyes were tired but focused. She sat at the small table, pulled out her needle and thread and began to sew. Her stitches were small and perfect, just like her grandmother had taught her. Tight, precise, unwavering, just like her. The soft hum of Eleanor Grant's sewing machine echoed through the small, dimly lit room. The steady thrum had become a familiar lullaby over the years, a rhythm that filled the house long after the world outside had gone to sleep. The glow from a single table lamp cast long shadows on the walls, highlighting rolls of fabric draped over chairs and stacks of thread spools lying neatly on the shelf. Eleanor's eyes blinked slowly, her gaze focused on the edge of the fabric she was hemming. The needle moved up and down, precise and sharp, guided by her steady hand. But tonight, her hand didn't feel as steady as usual. Her fingers twitched now and then, her grip slipping slightly before she corrected it. Her arm ached. It wasn't a sharp pain, more like a dull, pulsing throb that started in her shoulder and worked its way down to her wrist. She rubbed it absent-mindedly with her free hand, never taking her eyes off the fabric. "Just a little soreness," she muttered under her breath. "Too much sewing. Nothing more." The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes. Midnight came and went, but Eleanor didn't stop. There were deadlines to meet, customers to satisfy, and bills to pay. Her fingers ached, her arm throbbed, and her back felt like it had been carved from stone. But none of that mattered. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan and Grace. She'd given Ethan $40 last week, and it was unlikely she'd see it again. And Grace. Grace had barely spoken to her since the argument. She'd texted once, a simple, "I'll be home late." No apology. No effort to mend the hurt. She sighed deeply, tugging at the thread that had knotted itself by the edge of the fabric. Her heart ached more than her arm, but she didn't have the luxury of stopping to soothe it. Her hands moved automatically, her mind replaying the same thoughts that had been circling her for weeks. "I didn't ask for you to break your back for us. That was your choice." Grace's words echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than any needle ever could. Her jaw clenched, her hands pulling the thread tighter than necessary. She shook her head, willing herself to focus. "Don't think about it, Eleanor. Just finish the hem." But it was impossible to forget. The next morning, Willowbrook Market was alive with activity. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery stall mingled with the sharp tang of citrus from the fruit vendors. Shoppers moved in clusters, chatting as they selected their produce. The sun sat low in the sky, casting a golden glow on the world below. Eleanor's stall was already set up, her bundles of herbs neatly arranged in small baskets. Lavender, chamomile, peppermint, each one labeled in her careful handwriting. She sat behind the counter, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Mrs. Dorothy Woods arrived first, her sturdy frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through water. She wore a faded pink cardigan and carried her reusable shopping bag over one arm. As soon as she reached Eleanor's stall, she tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Eleanor," Dorothy said, her voice as sharp as ever. "You don't look well, hon. You eat anything this morning?" "I'm fine, Dorothy," Eleanor replied, lifting a basket of dried rosemary and placing it on the display table. Her arm protested with a sharp jolt of pain, but she pressed on, gritting her teeth. "Just tired, that's all." "More than tired, I'd say." Dorothy peered at her like a hawk searching for prey. "You're pale. Your eyes got that sunken look." She lowered her voice and leaned in. "You need to rest, Eleanor. Ain't nobody here gonna hold it against you if you take a day off." Eleanor shook her head. "Day off means no money, Dorothy." She forced a smile. "Besides, who's gonna remind you to brew your lemon balm tea at night if I'm not here?" Dorothy wasn't convinced. "You're stubborn, that's what you are." She sighed, digging into her bag for her wallet. "Give me 2 bundles of peppermint. And don't think I'm done talking to you." Eleanor chuckled softly, wincing as her arm flared with pain. She reached for the bundles, but her fingers didn't move as quickly as they usually did. It felt like moving through molasses. "Here you go," she said, her smile more strained now. "Thank you, hon." Dorothy paid her but didn't leave right away. She watched Eleanor closely, her lips pressed together in a line of disapproval. "Take care of yourself, girl. Pride don't pay hospital bills." "Noted, Dorothy," Eleanor replied, turning to adjust the chamomile bundles. The ache in her arm returned with renewed force. She squeezed her shoulder with one hand, massaging the muscle with firm, circular motions. Her fingers dug into the flesh, trying to find relief, but it was no use. The afternoon sun was blazing now, heating up the market and bringing a bead of sweat to Eleanor's brow. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, noticing for the first time how clammy her skin felt. She glanced down at her arm, rubbing it absently. It was starting to swell slightly at the joint. "Just a little soreness," she muttered to herself again, repeating the mantra like a prayer. "Just a little soreness." Another customer arrived, a young woman with a toddler balanced on her hip. Her child was squirming, his chubby hands reaching for everything in sight. "Hi, Mrs. Grant," she said with a smile. "Do you have anything to help him sleep at night? He's been up every hour this week." Eleanor smiled warmly, masking her pain as best she could. "Chamomile tea for you, little man," she said, reaching for a small jar. 1 teaspoon steeped in water. Let it cool before you give it to him." The toddler reached for the jar and Eleanor chuckled, handing it to the mother instead. Looks like he knows what he needs. The woman laughed. He sure does. Thanks so much, Mrs. Grant. You're a lifesaver. Take care now, Eleanor called as they walked away. She watched them go, her eyes lingering on the little boy's tiny hands wrapped around his mother's sleeve. For a moment, she saw Ethan as a boy again running through the kitchen, his face smeared with peanut butter, giggling as he dodged her attempts to wipe him clean. Her heart ached. Her arm ached worse. Back at home, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a hot water bottle resting on her shoulder. She'd taken off her apron and now wore an old gray sweater that smelled faintly of lavender. Her eyes flicked to the pile of bills at the end of the table. They were still there, still unpaid. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was Grace. Grace, do you have $20? I'll pay you back Friday. Eleanor stared at the message for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her thumb aching as she pressed it too hard against the glass. Her mind felt as tired as her body. Eleanor, no. I don't have it. She set the phone down, letting it buzz once more with an incoming message, but she didn't check it. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a moment. Her body felt heavier than it had ever felt before. Her shoulder throbbed. Her arm ached. Her heart ached too, but that wasn't new. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts grew soft. Just a minute, she told herself. Just 1 minute of rest. The soft hum of the sewing machine echoed faintly in her mind. The familiar rhythm. The lullaby of a woman who could never afford to stop moving. Her breathing grew shallow. Her arm twitched once, then stilled. The clock ticked on. The early morning sun cast long golden streaks across Willowbrook Market, giving everything a gentle glow. The world looked peaceful, even if the people moving through it weren't. The hum of the market was already building. Vendors calling out prices, customers haggling, the distant clang of crates being stacked. It was business as usual. But Eleanor Grant didn't feel usual. Her arm was worse than ever. The ache that had once been manageable now radiated from her shoulder to her fingertips. Her fingers felt stiff, like each joint was filled with gravel, and every motion sent a dull throb up her arm. It was the kind of pain that lingered, never sharp but never gone. Her grip on the small jar of eucalyptus oil faltered, and it slipped from her hands. It hit the ground with a dull thud, thankfully unbroken. "Dang it," she muttered, crouching down slowly to pick it up. Her knees protested as much as her arm, her whole body aching from weeks of overwork and no rest. As she stood, she pressed her palm into her lower back, wincing at the tightness there too. "Mrs. Grant, you all right?" She turned to see her most loyal customer, Mrs. Dorothy Woods, standing at the edge of the stall. Dorothy's eyes scanned Eleanor like a detective looking for clues. She took in the stiffness of her movements, the pale hue of her skin, and the faint tremble in her hands. "Morning, Dorothy," Eleanor said, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just a little stiff." "Stiff my foot," Dorothy shot back, stepping closer. "You look like you've been wrung out like an old rag. You ain't been sleeping, have you?" "Sleep's a luxury I can't afford," Eleanor said, setting the jar back on the shelf. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to hide the fact that they were still shaking. "Besides, I've got herbs to sell and bills to pay." Dorothy's brow furrowed, her hands on her hips. "Herbs and bills will still be here tomorrow, Eleanor. But if you keel over, who's gonna run this stall then, huh? You think your kids are gonna come swooping in to help?" The words stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. Her children. Ethan and Grace. It had been over a week since she'd seen either of them. Ethan hadn't answered her last message, and Grace had sent a single-word text, "busy," when Eleanor had asked if she'd be home for dinner. "I'm fine," Eleanor said again, this time with more force. "You know me, Dorothy. I've been through worse." "Yeah, and every time you've been through worse, you come out worse for it." Dorothy's voice softened. "Please, hon, go see a doctor. Get that arm checked." "I don't have time for doctors," Eleanor replied, turning back to rearrange the bundles of chamomile on her table. Her hands moved slower than usual, but she ignored the stiffness, forcing her fingers to grip and twist the twine. "Doctors don't pay bills, Dorothy. Work does." Dorothy sighed, long and heavy, but she didn't push further. She knew when she'd hit a wall. "All right, but you remember I told you. Don't make me say, 'I told you so.'" Eleanor nodded, still facing the herbs, her jaw set firm. She heard Dorothy's footsteps shuffle away, but her words lingered like a weight on Eleanor's chest. She didn't need to be reminded of her limits, she was already well aware of them. Later that day the air grew hotter, the sun high and relentless. The crowd at the market swelled, and Eleanor's customers came and went in waves. Her arms moved on autopilot, picking up jars, handing over herbs, accepting crumpled bills, and dropping coins into the payment jar. Each interaction was a blur of faces, hands, and voices. Her head felt light, like it was floating above her body. At first she thought it was the heat. She glanced up at the sun blazing through the clouds and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the sleeve of her apron. Her vision blurred for a second, the world around her twisting like it was underwater. She blinked hard, shaking her head. "Mom?" Her heart jumped. For a split second, she thought it was Ethan calling out to her. But when she turned, it was a teenage boy calling to his own mother at the fruit stall next door. She felt something deep inside her chest twist with disappointment. "Get it together," she muttered to herself. "Don't start seeing ghosts." The dizziness didn't go away though. It clung to her like the humidity in the air, making every movement feel just a little off. She bent down to grab another bundle of rosemary from a crate below the stall, and the moment she stood back up, the world tilted sideways. Her hand shot out to grab the edge of the table. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The dizziness passed after a few seconds, but she stayed still, her hand gripping the table so hard her fingers went white. A man buying peppermint tea leaves glanced her way. "Ma'am, you all right?" he asked, his brow creased with concern. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. She released her grip on the table and stood up straighter, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Just need a drink of water." She grabbed her water bottle and took a long sip, feeling his eyes on her the whole time. She hated the pity in people's eyes. She hated being seen as fragile. She was Eleanor Grant. She'd raised 2 kids alone, learned 2 trades, and worked 2 jobs. She was anything but fragile. The man nodded, giving her a small smile before walking off. But even after he left, she could feel the weight of his gaze, like it had burned a mark into her skin. That evening, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her head resting in her hands. She'd made it through another day, but it had taken everything she had. Her legs felt like jelly, and her arm had gone from a dull ache to a sharp, stabbing pain every time she moved it. Her chest felt tight too, as though she'd been carrying something heavy for too long. Her phone buzzed. "Grace, can you cash app me $20? I'll pay you back Friday." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart pounding harder than it should have. "Eleanor, I don't have it." The message sent. No explanation. No apology. She set the phone aside, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. She had spent years giving her children everything she had. And somehow they still asked for more. Her eyes flicked to the kitchen counter. There was a basket of onions and potatoes sitting there, but it might as well have been a mountain. The idea of cooking dinner felt like an impossible task. Her fingers twitched in her lap, her arm throbbing as if in protest. Her phone buzzed again. "Grace, whatever." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. She tilted her head back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Her throat felt tight, like she might cry, but no tears came. She had cried too many times already. Her eyes closed. Her head rested against the chair. Her body was as heavy as stone, but she didn't move. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts drifted. For just a moment, she let herself sink into the stillness. Her arm throbbed, but she didn't feel it. The pain had become part of her now, like her heartbeat or the ache of loneliness she'd lived with for years. Her breathing grew slower. The kitchen grew quieter. The world around her became softer, like the fabric she spent hours sewing each night. Soft, gentle, quiet. Her phone buzzed on the table again, but she didn't reach for it. The sun rose lazily over Willowbrook Market, spilling soft streaks of pink and orange across the sky. The early morning air buzzed with the sounds of crates being unloaded, metal carts rolling over cobblestone, and vendors calling out to one another. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the tang of citrus and the subtle sweetness of ripe peaches. It was a scene so familiar, so full of life, that it was easy to miss the signs of something going wrong. At her usual spot, Mrs. Eleanor Grant stood in front of her herb stall, slowly unpacking her baskets of dried herbs. Her fingers moved slower than usual, her grip on the bundles loose and unsteady. Her arm throbbed with every movement, the pain sharper now than it had been in weeks. She felt it every time she twisted the twine around a bundle of sage or lifted a jar of peppermint tea. Her body was screaming at her to stop, but Eleanor wasn't one to stop. Not for pain. Not for anything. "Morning, Eleanor," called Mr. Thompson, the butcher from across the way. He tipped his hat toward her, his smile as wide as always. "Hot one today, huh?" "Sure is," Eleanor called back, forcing a smile. Her lips barely moved. Her eyes were already dull with exhaustion. She adjusted the jars on her display, the muscles in her arm quivering with each small motion. The crowd grew thicker as more customers arrived. People chatted, haggled, and laughed. Children ran between the stalls, squealing with excitement. The world moved around her like a current of energy, but Eleanor felt like a stone at the bottom of the river. "Mrs. Grant," a woman called from in front of the stall. Eleanor looked up to see a familiar customer, a young mother with a toddler on her hip. The little boy waved at her with sticky fingers. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, waving back. "Do you have any chamomile left?" the mother asked, adjusting her child on her hip. "We're running low and he's been having trouble sleeping." "Of course," Eleanor replied, turning toward the shelf. Her hands fumbled for a moment as she searched for the jar. It was right in front of her, but it felt like it took an eternity to focus her eyes on it. She grabbed it and nearly dropped it. Her fingers barely wrapped around the glass. "Here," she said, placing the jar on the counter. Her hands hovered over it for a moment as if afraid it might fall. "You okay, Mrs. Grant?" the young woman asked, tilting her head in concern. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, brushing her hair back from her face. Her fingertips brushed against her own cheek, and for the first time she noticed how clammy her skin felt. Cold and damp. She pulled her hand away slowly. "Just a little tired." The woman glanced at her with worry but didn't press further. She dug through her purse for cash, handed it over, and offered a small smile. "Take care of yourself, okay? We need you around here." Eleanor nodded, her eyes drifting toward the table. Her vision blurred for a second and she had to blink hard to bring it back into focus. By midday the sun was high and unrelenting. The heat shimmered off the pavement, making the whole market feel like a furnace. Vendors wiped sweat from their brows and customers moved slower, fanning themselves with their hands. Eleanor was still at her stall, but her movements were sluggish. She felt like she was walking through honey. The dull ache in her arm had spread across her chest and up to her neck. Her breath came shallow and quick. Each inhale felt like dragging air through a straw. "Mrs. Grant, you want me to bring you some water?" It was one of the younger fruit vendors, a teenage boy named Caleb who sometimes helped her carry heavy crates. She waved him off, shaking her head. No, I've got some right here," she said, tapping the water bottle at the edge of her table. Her fingers missed it by an inch. Caleb frowned, but a customer called him away before he could say more. Eleanor leaned forward, gripping the edge of the counter. Her heart pounded in her chest, fast and uneven. She rubbed her arm again, her fingers pressing into the muscle hard enough to leave marks. It didn't help. It hadn't helped for weeks. Her breathing grew shallow and a bead of sweat rolled down her temple. Her eyes darted around, searching for a familiar face, but all she saw were strangers moving past her, unaware of the storm brewing inside her body. The world around her began to narrow. The chatter of the market grew distant, muffled, like it was happening through a wall of water. Her knees buckled. Her body swayed. Her hands reached for something to hold, but there was nothing but air. Eleanor Grant collapsed behind her stall. Her apron tangled around her as she crumpled to the ground, her head resting awkwardly against the leg of her chair. Her eyes fluttered, half open, staring at the space between the table and the ground. Shoppers walked past, their eyes on produce, prices, and vendors calling out deals. No one noticed the quiet figure lying in the shadow of the stall. To them, she looked like she had crouched down to grab something from beneath the table. Time passed. A man buying peaches glanced toward her stall. He squinted, noticing her stillness. He hesitated but moved on, assuming she was resting. Hours ticked by. The sun moved higher, its heat pressing down on everything. The crowd came and went in waves. Children laughed. Vendors shouted. Life carried on. Mrs. Dorothy Woods arrived around 3 p.m., her sturdy frame moving through the market with purpose. Her eyes were sharp as ever, scanning every stall. She stopped by the bakery for a loaf of bread, then made her way toward Eleanor's stall. Her brow furrowed the moment she saw Eleanor. "Eleanor?" she called, stepping closer. "You sleeping, girl? I told you, you gotta stop working so hard." No response. "Eleanor." Dorothy's voice grew firmer. She walked around the counter, her pace quickening. When she saw Eleanor on the ground, her heart stopped for half a second. "Oh Lord," Dorothy breathed, dropping her bag and kneeling beside her. She pressed her hand to Eleanor's cheek. Her skin was cold. Too cold. Dorothy shook her shoulder gently. "Eleanor? Eleanor, can you hear me?" "Nothing. Help." Dorothy's voice cut through the market like a siren. "Somebody call 911. She's not breathing." People turned, their heads snapping toward the sound of her voice. Vendors abandoned their stalls, rushing toward the scene. Customers gathered in a growing crowd. "She was fine this morning," someone said. "She must have fainted," another murmured. "Does anyone know CPR?" Dorothy shouted, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. Her fingers pressed against Eleanor's neck, but she felt nothing. Her breath hitched in her chest, panic rising like a flood. A man pushed through the crowd, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling 911, he yelled. "Hang on." Dorothy pressed both hands to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Her knees ached on the hard ground, but she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Eleanor, her friend, her stubborn, proud, unyielding friend. "Don't you do this," Dorothy whispered, tears rolling down her face. "Don't you dare do this to me, Eleanor Grant." But Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes were still half open, staring at nothing. Her hands were still. Her chest didn't rise. Time froze as sirens wailed in the distance. The crowd fell into a hush, their eyes locked on the figure of a woman who had been a constant presence in their lives but was now as still as the herbs she sold. The world moved on. The world always moved on. But for Dorothy, for those who knew Mrs. Eleanor Grant, something had stopped. Something they would never get back. The sirens drew closer, but Dorothy knew they were too late. "Too late," she whispered, cradling Eleanor's head in her hands. "Too late." The sharp buzz of a local radio announcer's voice cut through the air, crackling slightly as static flickered in and out. Ethan leaned back on a worn leather couch, his eyes half closed, a video game controller in his hands. The TV flickered with bright colors, but he wasn't paying attention. His friend, Marcus, was sitting next to him, furiously tapping buttons. "Man, you're terrible at this," Marcus laughed, nudging Ethan with his elbow. "Come on, focus." Yeah, Ethan muttered, squinting at the screen. His fingers moved, but there was no real effort behind it. His mind felt heavy like it had for the past week. The radio, barely audible over the video game sounds, continued its broadcast. It was mostly the usual chatter, weather updates, community announcements, and the DJ making jokes no one laughed at. But then the tone changed. "This just in," the announcer said, his voice suddenly serious. "Tragic news from Willowbrook Market earlier today. Longtime herbalist and beloved local vendor Mrs. Eleanor Grant was found unresponsive at her market stall this afternoon. Witnesses say she had been working her shift when she collapsed." Ethan's fingers froze. "No." He sat up straighter, his eyes darting toward the radio. He could feel his heart start to pound. Paramedics arrived on the scene, but unfortunately Mrs. Grant was pronounced dead shortly after. Market vendors and regulars are expressing their grief for the woman many knew as a source of wisdom, kindness, and support. Ethan's chest tightened. His breath came short and sharp like he'd been hit in the ribs. "Wait, what?" he muttered, his eyes locked on the radio. "Dude, you good?" Marcus glanced at him, confused by his sudden change in demeanor. "What's wrong?" Ethan's face went pale. His fingers curled around the edge of the couch, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Turn it up," he croaked, pointing at the radio. "Turn it up, Marcus." All right. Marcus leaned forward and twisted the volume knob. "Again, that's Mrs. Eleanor Grant, a beloved figure at Willowbrook Market, known for her herbal remedies and her stall that had been in the market for over a decade," the announcer said solemnly. "Her passing has left the community in shock. Many have described her as a pillar of strength, and a mother to everyone who knew her. More details to come as they are released." The words blurred into white noise. Ethan didn't hear them anymore. His mind had stopped at one phrase. Mrs. Eleanor Grant was found unresponsive. His mother. His mom. Dead. "Ethan?" Marcus said cautiously, his hand hovering over Ethan's shoulder. "You okay, man?" But Ethan was already on his feet, his breathing coming in short, shallow gasps. His mind flashed back to the last time he saw her. He had been standing by the door, hoodie halfway on, eyes narrowed with irritation. "I don't have time for this," he'd said, brushing past her without a second glance. "Anywhere but here." He had slammed the door so hard the frame shook. He remembered that clearly now. "Ethan, man, you're scaring me," Marcus said, standing up slowly. "What's going on?" "I gotta go," Ethan muttered, grabbing his jacket from the couch. His fingers fumbled with it, his whole body trembling. "I gotta go home." "Yo, hold up, I'll drive you," Marcus offered, grabbing his keys. But Ethan was already out the door, his heart pounding, his mind screaming one thing over and over. "It's my fault. It's my fault. It's my fault." Grace stood behind the counter at the small diner where she worked, tapping at the register with practiced efficiency. Orders came in one after another. Her feet ached from standing for hours, but she was used to it. She'd been on her feet all week. "Order up, Grace," called one of the line cooks from behind the kitchen window. "Got it," she replied, grabbing the tray and spinning around toward the dining area. Her movements were quick, precise, automatic. Her mind was somewhere else. She still hadn't texted her mom back since earlier that morning. "Can you cash app me $20?" she'd sent. "I don't have it." Her mom's reply had been short, but the message behind it had felt heavier than usual. Grace didn't reply, only sending a single word. "Whatever." Now, as she carried plates of burgers and fries to a table of teenagers, she felt a small twinge of guilt. She hadn't called her mom in days. It wasn't a big deal, she told herself. They'd talk later. The radio by the kitchen window was playing softly, just loud enough to hear. It was background noise until she heard the name. Mrs. Eleanor Grant. Her steps slowed. Her head whipped around toward the kitchen. Her ears strained to hear. "Was found unresponsive at her market stall this afternoon." Her heart stopped. Her hands went numb and the plates wobbled in her grip. "No." She rushed toward the counter, ignoring the call from one of the customers. Her hands fumbled with the radio's volume dial, cranking it higher. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death is currently unknown, but witnesses say she appeared to have collapsed behind her stall, where she remained for hours before being discovered. "No, no, no, no," Grace whispered, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. Her heart pounded like thunder in her chest. "No, that's not her. That's not my mom." Her vision blurred with tears and she clutched the edge of the counter for support. Her whole body shook. "Grace, you okay?" one of the cooks asked, stepping forward with concern. She didn't answer. Her mind was a flood of images. Her mom holding a bag of groceries. Her mom sewing at the kitchen table. Her mom's tired voice saying, "I'm not your assistant, Grace." The last time she saw her mother, they'd argued. Her mom had asked for help with the bills and Grace had snapped. "I didn't ask for you to break your back for us." The words echoed in her mind, sharp and cold. Her stomach twisted in knots. "I have to go," Grace said suddenly, wiping her eyes. She yanked her apron over her head, her heart racing. "I have to go." "Grace, you can't just," the manager called, but she was already gone. When Ethan arrived at the house, he saw Grace's car parked in the driveway. He stumbled out of the cab, his legs weak. His chest felt like it was caving in. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air smelled of lavender, faint but familiar. For a moment he thought his mom might be in the kitchen. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they got the name wrong. But when he stepped into the kitchen, he saw Grace. She was sitting at the table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He didn't say anything. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. Their eyes met, and for once, neither of them had anything to say. They didn't argue. They didn't blame. They just sat there, side by side, both too broken to speak. "Ethan," Grace finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "She's gone." He nodded, his eyes distant and hollow. "I know." The weight of their regrets sat between them, heavier than any burden they'd ever carried. Ethan leaned forward, his hands pressed to his face, tears soaking his palms. Grace's breath hitched and she reached for his hand. They sat like that for a long time, two children in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. And for the first time, they both realized something they should have seen long ago. They had been given everything. And somehow they'd still asked for more. The church bell tolled slowly, its deep, echoing sound carrying through the quiet streets of Willowbrook. It was an overcast day, gray clouds hanging low as if the sky itself was mourning. Rows of cars lined the narrow road outside the small church, their windshields glistening with light rain. People moved toward the entrance in clusters, their faces somber, voices hushed. Inside, the scent of old wood, fresh lilies, and faint incense filled the air. The soft hum of whispered conversations bounced off the high, arched ceilings. Every pew was nearly full. Market vendors, sewing clients, and townsfolk who had once stopped by Eleanor Grant's herb stall now sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching tissues and wiping their eyes. At the front of the church, framed by sprays of white lilies and soft yellow roses, lay a simple wooden casket. On top of it rested a small bundle of dried lavender and rosemary, tied together with twine, a quiet symbol of the life she had lived. Ethan and Grace sat in the front pew, side by side, their faces marked with grief. Ethan kept his head down, his hands clasped tightly together between his knees. Grace sat stiff and upright, her eyes fixed on the casket, blinking away tears she didn't want to fall. They had arrived together that morning, but neither of them had said much since. What could they say? Every attempt to speak had been met with silence too thick to break. The only sound between them was the small, sharp sniffles Grace let out every few minutes. Ethan had glanced at her once but quickly looked away, his eyes red and swollen from the tears he refused to shed in public. Reverend Wallace, a tall man with a kind face and a voice as steady as stone, stepped up to the pulpit. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "Today we gather to honor the life of Mrs. Eleanor Grant," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "A healer, a mother, a friend. A woman who gave so much of herself, often at the expense of her own well-being." His words settled over the crowd like a soft blanket, covering each heart with the weight of shared grief. A few people nodded, others dabbed their eyes with tissues. "Mrs. Grant didn't just sell herbs," the Reverend continued. "She sold hope. She sold compassion. When you were sick, she had a remedy. When you were worried, she had advice. When you were lonely, she had time to listen." He paused, his eyes settling on Ethan and Grace. "She had time for all of us. Every one of us." Grace's head dipped forward and a soft sob escaped her lips. Ethan's jaw tightened as he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. After the Reverend's eulogy, he opened the floor for anyone who wanted to speak. For a moment no one moved. People glanced at one another, hesitant to be the first. Then Mrs. Dorothy Wood stood, her cardigan draped over her shoulders like a coat of armor. She made her way slowly to the front, gripping the side of the pews for balance. Once at the microphone, she gave the room a firm look. Her eyes landed on Ethan and Grace and she sighed. "Well, I suppose if no one else is brave enough, I'll go first," Dorothy said, her voice strong despite the tremble in it. She glanced at the casket, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I met Eleanor at the market like most of you. I was having trouble sleeping and she handed me a bundle of lemon balm. Told me to steep it in tea before bed." Dorothy let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I told her I didn't believe in all that herbal magic nonsense." The crowd chuckled quietly. She said, "Whether you believe it or not, it'll still work." And wouldn't you know it? It did. Dorothy sniffed, pulling a handkerchief from her sleeve to dab her eyes. She always knew what people needed, not just herbs but words. She had a way of making you feel seen, like you weren't alone. Her gaze shifted to Ethan and Grace, her eyes sharp with intent. "You two listen to me," she said, pointing a finger in their direction. "Your mother gave so much to this town. She carried more weight than any one person should have to carry. And now you have to ask yourselves, what will you give back?" Ethan's face twisted, his eyes brimming with tears. Grace's lip quivered, her gaze dropping to her lap. Dorothy stared at them for a long moment before turning her attention back to the crowd. "That's all I'll say," Dorothy finished, folding her hands in front of her. "Don't forget her. Don't forget what she taught you." The sound of her footsteps echoed as she made her way back to her seat. Ethan's eyes followed her, but he didn't say a word. Grace wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. One by one, people rose to speak. An elderly man named Mr. Fletcher, a retired schoolteacher, stood and spoke of how Eleanor had brought him peppermint tea during his long recovery from surgery. "I don't know if it was the tea or her company that healed me, but I'm sure it was her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. One of her sewing clients, Mrs. Belinda Harper, shared how Eleanor had sewn her granddaughter's prom dress after the tailor canceled at the last minute. "She didn't charge me a dime. Said, 'This one's on me, baby girl needs to feel beautiful.'" A younger woman, one of Eleanor's neighbors, shared how Eleanor had given her a salve for her baby's rash. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice cracking. "But Mrs. Grant, she just knew. She always knew." Story after story poured out, each one another thread in the tapestry of Eleanor Grant's legacy. She was a healer, a comforter, and a giver. She had done so much for so many, but how much of herself had she kept for her own? When the service ended, the pallbearers moved toward the casket. Ethan and Grace followed them, stepping slowly behind the casket as it was carried down the aisle. The church grew quiet as everyone watched them walk, their steps heavy with grief. Ethan kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the floor. Grace's shoulders shook with silent sobs. As they reached the church doors, Ethan suddenly stopped. He sucked in a sharp breath and wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. His face crumpled and he shook his head, unable to move. Grace stopped too, reaching for his arm. "It's okay," she whispered. Her voice was broken, but there was strength in it. "We'll get through it." He nodded, his face wet with tears. "I never got to say sorry, Grace." His voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't even say goodbye." "Me neither," she said, her voice cracking like glass. They both stood there, paralyzed by the weight of everything they hadn't done, everything they hadn't said. "Come on," Grace said softly, gripping his arm tighter. "We have to keep going." With slow, shuffling steps they moved forward, following the casket as it was loaded into the hearse. The rain had started to fall harder now, soft drops turning into a steady patter on the pavement. Ethan raised his head, looking at the casket one last time. The bundle of lavender and rosemary still sat on top, untouched. He felt something shift in his chest, something hollow and cold but somehow necessary. Dorothy's words echoed in his mind. "What will you give back?" As the hearse pulled away, Ethan and Grace stood together, side by side. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was full of understanding. For the first time in a long time they were no longer running away. The rain had not let up. Tiny droplets tapped softly on the roof of the funeral home like a clock ticking down each second of silence. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth and the sharp tang of lilies. People moved slowly, their steps muffled by the thick, plush carpet. The crowd had thinned. Most of the mourners had left, offering quiet condolences, tearful hugs, and promises to check in with Ethan and Grace. But they all left. Everyone always left. Now it was just the two of them. The quiet was oppressive, a thick weight that neither of them knew how to lift. Ethan stood a few feet away from the casket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His head was down, his eyes locked on the floor as if it had all the answers he couldn't find. His jaw was tight, his teeth clenched so hard that his temples throbbed. Grace sat on the nearest bench, elbows on her knees, hands buried in her hair. Her shoulders shook with every shallow, uneven breath. She'd run out of tissues hours ago, and now her sleeves were damp from wiping her eyes. They had barely spoken since the service ended. Ethan glanced at Grace from the corner of his eye. Her face was blotchy, red from all the crying, but she hadn't stopped. She hadn't even tried to stop. She just kept her head down, sobbing into her hands. He turned toward the casket, simple, unadorned, with a spray of white lilies on top. His mother's face, calm and still, was framed by a silk pillow. The sight made his heart lurch in his chest. She looked so small, so quiet. She had never been quiet. He approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant. It felt wrong to walk up to her like this, like he'd be disturbing her rest. His breaths came shallow, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the edge of the casket, his hands hovered in the air as if unsure where to place them. Eventually, they settled on the edge of the wood, his fingertips pressing against it like he was afraid it would break. His throat tightened. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped, his tongue heavy, his lips dry. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the lump in his throat back down. But it didn't go away. When he opened his eyes again, he stared at her face. Her eyes were closed. Her skin looked soft and peaceful, but he knew it was only a trick. She wasn't peaceful. She was gone. And it was his fault. The thought hit him so hard it nearly knocked the air out of his lungs. His chest caved in as if someone had hit him square in the ribs. He let out a short, sharp gasp and then covered his face with his hands. "I'm sorry, Mom," he muttered, his voice cracking. His words were barely audible at first, but he didn't stop. His breaths came faster, more uneven. "I should have been there for you. I should have helped. I should have been better." His shoulders shook as the first sob broke free. "I was so stupid," he choked, his voice louder now, filled with anger, not at anyone else but at himself. "I thought you'd always be here. I thought I had more time." His hands gripped the edge of the casket, his knuckles white. He bowed his head, his tears hitting the wood in soft, rhythmic drops. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered again, his voice hoarse. His shoulders slumped, his whole body curling inward. "I'm so sorry." Behind him, Grace let out a sharp, broken sob. Her hands dropped from her face and she leaned forward, her head in her hands. Her breathing was shallow and fast, her chest rising and falling like she was trying to keep from drowning. "I blamed you for everything," she said suddenly, her voice raw. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself." She let out a soft, bitter laugh that turned into a hiccuping sob. "I blamed you and you still loved me. How could you do that?" Her voice cracked, her fingers clutching at her hair. "How could you love me after everything I said to you?" She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face turned toward the casket. Her eyes locked on her mother's face and it broke her all over again. Her mouth opened like she was going to speak, but no sound came out. Her face twisted into a grimace, her lips trembling. She pressed her hands over her face, letting out a deep, guttural cry. She slid off the bench, dropping to her knees on the carpet. Her hands pressed against the front of the casket, her fingers splayed wide. She leaned her forehead against the wood, her tears soaking into it. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared of being responsible. I didn't want to grow up. I didn't want to be like you, working so hard all the time, carrying everything on your back. I thought if I stayed far enough away I wouldn't have to feel it. But I did." Her voice broke, her words coming out in short, breathless bursts. "I feel it now, Mom. I feel it now." Her whole body shook as she cried harder than she ever had in her life. Her fingers pressed into the wood like she could reach through it, like she could pull her mother back from the other side. Her chest heaved with each sob, her heart splitting open with every breath. Behind her, Ethan lowered himself to his knees. He crawled forward until he was next to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. He just reached out and placed a hand on her back, his fingers curling gently into her sweater. Grace glanced at him, her eyes red and swollen. She sniffled, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. She didn't pull away from him. She didn't say anything either. She just leaned into him, letting her head rest on his shoulder. For a long moment they stayed like that, two broken children kneeling beside their mother's casket, holding on to each other like they were the only things keeping each other upright. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof like a heartbeat. The last few attendees remained in the back of the room, watching in silence. Mrs. Dorothy Wood stood among them, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes glassy with tears she hadn't let fall. "About time," she muttered quietly, more to herself than anyone else. She pulled a tissue from her sleeve and dabbed at her eyes, letting out a long, slow sigh. Her gaze didn't leave Ethan and Grace. Her heart ached for them, not with pity but with hope. They'd broken, yes, but sometimes breaking was the only way to rebuild. An elderly man standing next to her shook his head slowly. "Poor kids," he muttered. "Too young to be losing their mom." Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Old enough to know better," she said firmly, glancing at him. "They'll learn now. People always learn too late." Her words lingered in the air, mixing with the quiet sobs and soft patter of rain. Back at the casket, Grace's sobs had quieted to soft sniffles. She wiped her eyes, still leaning against Ethan. He stared at his mother's face, his heart heavier than it had ever been. "You think she hears us?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced at her, his face still wet with tears. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in it. "I think she hears everything." They both sat in silence, side by side, still leaning against the casket like children clinging to their mother's arms. Their grief was a wound, fresh and raw, but it wasn't empty. Their mother had spent her whole life carrying them, but now for the first time they were carrying her. They would carry her forever. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained. Days after the funeral, the air was still damp, and the world seemed coated in a gray film. It wasn't just the weather. The house itself felt heavier, quieter, as if the absence of Eleanor Grant had settled into the walls and furniture. The kitchen smelled faintly of lavender, not because anyone had used it but because that smell had always been there. It lingered like her. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the basket of onions and potatoes that hadn't been touched since the night before she died. They were starting to sprout small green shoots. Life always found a way to keep growing, even when everything else felt like it had stopped. His phone buzzed on the table but he didn't look at it. His hands rested on his knees, his eyes distant. The chair next to him was empty, but he glanced at it as if expecting his mother to walk in at any moment, tea in one hand, her sewing bag in the other. The front door opened with a soft creak. Ethan glanced up to see Grace stepping in, her jacket soaked from the drizzle outside. She pulled off her hood, shaking her hair loose. Her eyes met his briefly before she looked away. "Thought you'd be gone," she said, hanging her jacket on the hook near the door. Her voice was softer than usual. No sharp edges, no bite. Just exhaustion. "Nowhere to go," Ethan replied, his eyes dropping back to the table. "I quit my job yesterday." Grace froze mid-step, slowly turning toward him. Her eyebrows raised, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. "What? You serious?" "Yeah," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't feel right being there anymore. I just sit there thinking about all the hours Mom put in, all the things she did to keep us going, and there I was, doing the bare minimum." He let out a bitter laugh. Couldn't stomach it anymore. Grace leaned against the wall, her eyes studying him like she was seeing him for the first time. "What are you gonna do now?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest. He shrugged, his fingers tapping softly on the edge of the table. Don't know yet. Thought about maybe working at the community center. They've got this outreach program for kids, tutoring, after-school stuff. He glanced at her, his face cautious, unsure of himself. Figured, I dunno, maybe I could be useful there. Do something that actually matters. Her eyes softened, and for once she didn't have a snarky remark. She just nodded. That sounds good, she said quietly, looking down at her shoes. Sounds like something Mom would have liked. Ethan nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, she would have. Later that evening, Grace sat on the floor of their mother's sewing room. The space was smaller than she remembered, though she hadn't set foot in it for months before now. The walls were lined with shelves full of fabric, jars of buttons, and spools of thread in every color. Her mother's old sewing machine sat on the small table by the window. The chair was still pulled out, as if Eleanor had only stepped away for a moment. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by half-finished projects. Dresses, pillowcases, children's clothes. Pieces of fabric lay draped over her lap. She picked up one of the small shirts, turning it over in her hands. It was meant for a little boy, the tiny sleeves just big enough to fit a toddler. Her eyes blurred with tears as she ran her fingers over the stitching. It was flawless as always. Perfect, precise, unyielding. Just like her mother. Her throat tightened as she thought of the last conversation she'd had with her mom. I didn't ask for you to break your back for us. Those words had been sharp, cold, and final. Her heart twisted at the memory. She wiped her face quickly, sniffing hard. All right, Mom, she muttered to herself, rolling up her sleeves. You carried us long enough. Guess it's my turn. Grace pulled herself up and sat at the sewing table. Her fingers hovered over the sewing machine's wheel, hesitant. She'd watched her mother do this 1,000 times, but she had never really paid attention. She'd been too busy with her phone, her friends, her excuses. Her fingers brushed the side of the machine. Show me what to do, Mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Show me. Her fingers gripped the wheel, slowly turning it just like she'd seen her mother do. The needle lowered, the thread tightened, and the machine came to life with a low hum. Her heart ached. Her chest felt heavy. But her hands were steady. The following week, Ethan and Grace found themselves sitting at the kitchen table together. Something they hadn't done in years. Ethan sipped coffee from one of their mom's old mugs. Grace sat across from him, her fingers working a seam on one of the unfinished dresses she'd found in the sewing room. Her stitches weren't perfect. Some were too tight, others too loose. Her face scrunched with concentration, her tongue poking out slightly from the corner of her mouth. You missed a spot, Ethan said, pointing at a loose thread near the bottom of the dress. Grace glared at him, yanking the thread free. I know, she muttered, holding it up to examine it. It's harder than it looks. Didn't say it was easy, Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes drifted to the window. Rain trickled down the glass, blurring the view of the street outside. You're doing all right, though. Grace blinked, looking up at him. Did you just give me a compliment? He shrugged, smirking a little. Don't get used to it. They both laughed, quiet but genuine. It felt strange laughing like that. For a moment, the weight didn't feel so crushing. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the soft hum of the rain and the quiet pull of thread through fabric. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching Grace's hands move with careful precision. It reminded him so much of their mother that it hurt, but it was a good kind of hurt. The kind that lets you know something is still there. Think she'd be proud of us? Grace asked suddenly, not looking up from the dress. Her hands didn't stop moving. Ethan's eyes flicked to the sewing machine in the corner, the table still lined with jars of buttons and fabric scraps. He thought of their mother sitting there, working late into the night, fingers pricked with tiny cuts from the needle. She never once complained. Not once. Yeah, he said quietly, staring at the machine like she was still sitting there. Yeah, she'd be proud. Grace glanced up at him. For the first time there was no snark, no defensiveness, no wall. Just her. Just his sister. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. That night, Ethan walked into the sewing room. He stood in front of the table, eyes fixed on the machine. His fingers hovered over the wheel like Grace's had. He turned it slowly, watching the needle dip down and rise back up. Don't worry, Mom, he whispered, his voice low and steady. We'll figure it out. His fingers tapped the edge of the table. We'll figure it out, he repeated, his eyes unwavering. I promise. He stayed there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the house around him. No footsteps. No rustling fabric. No tired sighs from the kitchen. Just stillness. But for the first time, the stillness didn't feel so empty. The next morning, Grace came downstairs to find Ethan in the kitchen. pouring pancake batter onto the stove. The smell of vanilla filled the air. She blinked, rubbing her eyes. "Who are you and what have you done with my brother?" "Shut up and grab a plate," Ethan said, flipping a pancake with a grin. "They're not gonna flip themselves." She snorted, grabbing a plate from the cabinet. The house still smelled of lavender, but this time it smelled of pancakes too. The smell of fresh herbs filled the air, mingling with the crisp bite of autumn leaves carried by the soft morning breeze. The sun peeked through the clouds, spilling golden light over Willowbrook Market. It wasn't as crowded as usual, but there were enough people to create that familiar buzz of life. The shouts of vendors echoed through the open space, blending with the chatter of early morning shoppers. Ethan and Grace stood side by side in front of the stall that once belonged to their mother. It had been cleaned, polished, and reassembled with care. The worn sign at the top had been replaced, but not forgotten. The new sign, carved with smooth edges and painted a rich, earthy green, read, "Eleanor Grant's Healing Herbs, a Legacy of Love." The words shined in the morning sun, and for the first time in a long time Ethan and Grace smiled as they read it. "Looks good, huh?" Ethan said, nudging Grace with his elbow. Grace tilted her head, squinting at the sign with mock scrutiny. "Yeah, not bad," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "The color's a little off though." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Color's perfect. You just like being difficult." She snickered, tossing a dried sprig of rosemary at him. He caught it with ease, grinning. For once, their teasing didn't feel sharp or defensive. It felt like something new, something good. The stall looked full again, just like it had when their mother ran it. Baskets of dried lavender, sage, chamomile, and rosemary lined the shelves. Jars of tea blends stood in neat rows, each one labeled with Eleanor's distinct handwriting that Grace had practiced over the last few weeks to make sure it looked just right. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. The first customer of the day approached, a middle-aged woman with a soft smile and a little girl holding her hand. Her eyes darted from the new sign to Ethan and Grace, her smile widening as she recognized them. "Well, look at this," the woman said, stepping closer. "I wasn't sure if you two would bring it back, but here you are." Grace tucked her hair behind her ear, glancing at Ethan before answering. "Yeah, we figured it was time." "You're doing a good thing," the woman said, her voice gentle and sincere. "Your mom would be proud." She glanced at the little girl at her side. "Maya, say hello." "Hi," the little girl chirped, waving her tiny hand. "Hey Maya," Ethan said, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. "You like peppermint tea? It's sweet." Maya nodded shyly, hiding behind her mom's leg. "Then you'll love this," he said, pulling a small bundle of peppermint from the shelf. "Smell it." The little girl leaned in, her eyes going wide as she took a deep breath. "It smells like candy," she squealed. "That's right," Ethan said, his grin growing wider. "And it tastes even better." The mother pulled out a few bills, paying for the bundle, and smiled at Ethan and Grace. "It's good to see her legacy still going," she said softly. "She helped so many people." Ethan and Grace exchanged a glance, both of them feeling that familiar tightness in their chests. But this time, it wasn't grief. It was something warmer. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice steady. They watched as the woman and her daughter disappeared into the crowd, and for a moment Ethan stood in silence, hands on his hips. "She's right," he said, tilting his head toward Grace. "Mom helped so many people." Grace nodded. "Yeah, she did." Her eyes wandered over the stall, from the baskets of herbs to the hanging bundles of sage. Her fingers trailed along the edge of the counter. "And now it's our turn." Later that morning, Mrs. Dorothy Woods arrived like a storm front, fast, loud, and commanding every ounce of attention. She marched up to the stall with her reusable shopping bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes scanned the herbs, her nose twitching like a seasoned critic. "Not bad," Dorothy said, nodding as she reached for a bundle of chamomile. She lifted it, giving it a sniff before nodding again. "Not bad at all. You two might make something of yourselves after all." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Is that the closest thing to a compliment we're gonna get from you, Dorothy?" Dorothy snorted, tossing the chamomile back onto the table. "Don't push your luck, girl. I'm still watching you." She jabbed a finger in their direction but smiled as she did. "Come on, Dorothy," Ethan said, leaning on the counter with a grin. "Give us a little credit. We did all this ourselves." "You did most of it right," she admitted, stepping closer and eyeing them both. Her smile faded just a bit as her eyes softened. "Your mama would be proud." Those words hit differently. Grace ducked her head, blinking back tears, while Ethan scratched the back of his neck, looking off into the distance. Neither of them responded right away. Dorothy reached out, placing her hand on Grace's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You listen to me," Dorothy said firmly, her eyes flicking between them. "Don't just keep this place running. Grow it. People need these herbs, but they also need you too. They need to see that something good can come back after it's been broken." Her gaze lingered on Ethan. "You hear me, boy?" "Yeah, I hear you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sure. "Good," she said, stepping back. "Now, where's my lemon balm tea? I'm fresh out." Grace quickly reached for a jar, placing it on the counter with a small grin. "On the house, Dorothy." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "Don't you start giving stuff away. You ain't made of money." "It's a gift," Grace insisted, tapping the jar with her finger. "For everything you did for Mom." Dorothy didn't argue. She placed the jar in her bag with a satisfied nod. "You're learning. The sun rose higher in the sky, burning away the last of the gray clouds. More customers arrived as the market grew busier, their faces bright with recognition and joy when they spotted the new sign. One by one, people came up to the stall. Some shared stories of how Eleanor had helped them, how she'd cured their coughs or made salves for their burns. Others came just to say they were happy to see the stall again. Each kind word stitched something back into Ethan and Grace that they hadn't realized had been torn apart. Hours passed and the crowd eventually thinned. Ethan stood at the back of the stall, wiping his hands on a cloth. Grace packed away the empty jars, humming softly to herself. He glanced over at her, watching as she neatly stacked the baskets. She wasn't fast, but she was careful. Every jar, every bundle, every sprig of rosemary was handled with the same care their mother had given to everything she touched. "You're getting good at that," Ethan said, his voice light. "Don't sound so surprised," Grace shot back, smiling. They both laughed. Real laughter. The kind that doesn't come from jokes, but from knowing you're finally okay. Ethan took one last look at the sign. Eleanor Grant's Healing Herbs, a legacy of love. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Hey, Grace," he said, tilting his head toward her. "Yeah?" she asked, still focused on her work. "You think she's watching us?" Grace paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. Her eyes, still a little red, were soft with certainty. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I think she is." They both stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle in. No more running. No more hiding. No more waiting for someone else to carry the weight. They were carrying it now. Together. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy.